Hello and welcome to this second episode of Henry VIII The Reign, An Old Tale of Wives. I'm Mark Holinshed and this is the second episode titled Anne de Boleyn and on to 1521. We'll do as the title says, and that's take a look at the woman who I mentioned at the conclusion of the first episode, who it seems at times, at least in our present age, to dominate the scene as much, if not more, than the king himself. And then in 1521, the plots for which the reign is famous, or infamous, begin to emerge. So in the latter part of this episode, we complete our backstory, which involves the events and the people who took centre stage in shaping the reign of Henry VIII over the next 25 years or so, and in truth, I suppose, for centuries to follow. But first, the enigma that was Anne de Boleyn, the Queen of England. The Queen of England without a date or a place of birth. Indeed, the Queen of England without a date or place of marriage. What we do know, however, is she was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn and his wife Elizabeth Howard, daughter of Thomas Howard, the second Duke of Norfolk. At some time in 1512, her father became ambassador to the Low Countries and he secured her a place of education at the court of Margaret of Austria, no less. So it seems likely she encountered young Archduke Charles there. When we refer to Thomas Boleyn being an ambassador, we need to be a little circumspect. The idea of a resident ambassador was still developing at the time. The papacy had begun the practice in the states of the Italian peninsula towards the end of the previous century. In fact, the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography claims that Thomas Boleyn was chosen as an English pioneer of the resident rather than the extraordinary ambassador. The extraordinary ambassador, conversely, was traditionally sent on a specific mission and was expected to return once the assignment was complete. We therefore need to be a little bit careful not to assume that an ambassador was away for a number of years in one place. It's also possible at that time that an ambassador to a particular country may have conducted a shuttle form of diplomacy back and forth between nations. As the century moved on, so the role of the resident ambassador progressed and later became the norm. There has always been much speculation, quarrelsome speculation, about how Anne came to be in France, much of which centres on the great entourage of ladies that Henry's sister Mary took over there at the time of her marriage to King Louis. Anne also had a sister called Mary, and her name was on the list of those who went, but Anne's was not. The most likely explanation for that is that she travelled overland directly from Margaret of Austria's court in the Low Countries. Whichever way, I tend to think that as her father was one of the most senior, if not the most senior diplomats in service to the king, she probably travelled unobtrusively with him here, there and anywhere on any number of occasions. Irrespective of how she arrived there, we do know this daughter of one of England's high-flying Whitehall mandarins became attached to the court of Francis's wife Claude, and spent most of the next 10 years, if not longer, in and around the French royal palaces, particularly those in the Loire Valley. Indeed, she so thoroughly took France to her heart as to seem, said the diplomat Lancelot de Carle, a native-born Frenchwoman, and she seemed to believe, as others did about her, she was something even more, a French princess. That persona was certainly the reason for her rise, and her exaggeration of it even more certainly the cause of her fall. From about the mid-1400s, as the 100 Years' War with England came to an end, French royalty favoured the Loire Valley as their place of residence. Indeed, King Francis was brought up at his mother's chateau in Amboise. That great man from Florence, architect, engineer and painter, Leonardo da Vinci, accepted an invitation to live next door at the Chateau Clos du Lucé. The two chateaux were connected by an underground passage, and da Vinci spent the last years of his life at Amboise, and Francis attended him on his deathbed. "20 miles northeast of Amboise was and still is the Chateau de Blois. The chateau is much famed in England, not least for the romantic illusions of Anne de Boleyn treading the stairs of the renowned spiral staircase on the courtyard-facing wall of the Francis I wing. Queen Claude, it seems, persuaded Francis that she preferred Blois to Amboise, and she had the king build the magnificent edifice, which today attracts many thousands of visitors a year. We have a piece of evidence from some years later, in 1535, when she was Queen of England, that sheds some light on the relationship with the French royal family, and Marguerite in particular. In September that year, Ambassador Jean d'Interville, he of ambassador's painting fame, arrived in Winchester to tell Henry that King Francis of France had been tasked by the Pope to effect Henry's excommunication from the Church. Anne sent a message back to France with d'Interville. It was to Marguerite, to say her greatest wish, next to having a son, was to see you, Marguerite, again. D'Interville had brought news that the Pope had issued a brief depriving Henry of his realm and his royal dignity. Worse for Anne, the Pope had called on Francis, King of France, her patron, to enforce the excommunication. Said Pope Paul to Francis, "Be ready to execute justice on Henry when required. Remember the great armies with which Francis's forefathers had revenged her," that's Francis, "injuries." The brief cited the execution of Bishop of Rochester John Fisher, which had taken place just a few weeks earlier, and the sacrilegious slaughter of so many other clerks and religious men. The Pope claimed that Henry's actions had exceeded the wickedness of his ancestors and their treatment of Thomas Becket. However, on the other side, the Seymour Cromwell strategy was going to plan. The execution of Fisher and Sir Thomas More had been orchestrated to solicit just such a response from Rome. Anne de Boleyn was marooned, her position all but hopeless. she was isolated, surrounded by enemies in England, while to her horror, her friends in France were licensed by the Pope to deprive her husband of his kingdom by force. To save herself from the clutches of the incoming faction, her time was almost gone. The Cromwell-Seymour party had already chosen the next Queen of England. She had but two very distant hopes. The first, that she could deliver a son to Henry, and so bond herself indelibly to the King of England. Or that she returned to her home kingdom, the Kingdom of France. It would have been a heartfelt message to be delivered personally by d'Interville to her mentor in the Loire Valley. She had been pleading for help from France for months. 8 months earlier that year, for example, diplomat Palamedes Gontier had reported to his predecessor, who was now the Admiral of France, Philippe Chabot, and explained that in the afternoon Cromwell took him, Gontier, to the Queen, to whom he delivered the Admiral's letters and charge. She complained of his long delay, which had caused her husband many doubts. She said the Admiral must think of applying some remedy and act towards the King, so that she may not be ruined and lost, for she sees herself near that, and in more grief and trouble than before her marriage. She charged him to beg the Admiral to consider her affairs, of which she could not speak as fully as she wished, on account of her fears and the eyes which were looking at her, her husband's and the Lords present. She said she could not write nor see him again, nor stay longer. She then left him, the King going to the next room where the dance was beginning, without the said lady going thither. As far as he can judge, she is not at her ease on account of the doubts and suspicions of the King, which he has mentioned before. In September then, Anne was returning slowly to Windsor with the Royal Progress, that is to say the Royal Tour, which had travelled through the western counties of England. The entourage, which fluctuated in numbers as it travelled around the country of probably between 1,000 and 2,000 people, had set out from Windsor for Bristol in July 1535 and returned via Winchester and arrived back at Windsor in the late autumn. They had travelled through the lands ravaged by the Anarchy, a civil war which had raged for year after year between 1135 and 1153. The war had been a fight for the English crown. The conflict between Stephen of Blois, grandson of William the Conqueror, and Matilda, Henry I's daughter, and thus the granddaughter of William the Conqueror. Matilda was a woman, and being such was at the root of the conflict. Bristol, during the Civil War, became the western capital of England, and Henry VIII's tour had been arranged as part of a character assassination of Anne de Boleyn and her assumed pedigree. It succeeded, and she was executed a few months after they returned. So what has that to do with the Chateau of Blois? Well, it's inconceivable that during her time there, Anne did not learn some of its history. It's almost as inconceivable that she and her family did not know the history of the chateau before she even arrived there. And perhaps she even went to the chateau of Blois because of its history. The first record of a building on the site was a castle built by the Counts of Blois in the 800s. Over the following centuries it was developed by successive counts, one of which was Stephen, that same Stephen of the Anarchy. Stephen was much inspired to claim the kingdom of England by his wife Maud. Maud was the Countess of Boulogne, daughter of Count Eustace of Boulogne. Eustace played a very significant part in the conquest of 1066. As a consequence, as a reward, he became one of the wealthiest landowners in England, with holdings all over the kingdom, including Kent and even more extensively in Norfolk and Suffolk. A glance at the online National Archives records shows dozens and dozens, indeed hundreds and hundreds of land records in the name of Eustace Boulogne all over England. He also maintained holdings in France. So this guy was a big shot by any standard, and his daughter inherited his ambition. Now, in November 1120, William Ayling, Henry I's only legitimate son, drowned in the so-called White Ship disaster. His premature death created a succession crisis, and the descendants of William the Conqueror split into two bitterly opposing sides, and a 19-year-long civil war ensued. After the death of his son, the grieving king chose Matilda, granddaughter of William the Conqueror, in preference to his nephew, Stephen of Blois, grandson of the Conqueror, to inherit the throne. To secure his preference, he had his barons swear an allegiance to Matilda when she became queen, and at the same time swear allegiance to any heirs that she might have. But when Henry died in 1134, many of the barons ripped up the oath, claiming they had been coerced, and so sided with Stephen and his claim to the Kingdom of England. The war, the Anarchy as it became known, 19 years when Christ and his saints slept, was a brutal conflict. Matilda and her half-brother Robert of Gloucester led one side, and Stephen of Blois, his Queen Countess of Boulogne, and their son, another Eustace de Boulogne, led the other side. He split England in half, west-east, and for the most part commanded from Bristol and Gloucester in the west, and in the east command flowed from London and the ebbing fortunes of the cities of Winchester and Lincoln. But after 19 years of death and destruction, who could eventually unite the Kingdom of England? Would it be Matilda's son, Henry Plantagenet, or Maud and Stephen's son, Eustace de Boulogne? Eventually, Matilda with her half-brother Robert emerged victors, but it had been so close, oh so close. The conflict over 3 decades could have gone either way. If Matilda had lost, England would have a very different history. The Plantagenet dynasty would never have existed, and Eustace would have been the first king of the de Boulogne dynasty. Victory, however, did not unite the kingdom, but served only to deepen a pre-existing east-west split. Wales, over the preceding centuries, had become the home of the descendants of the first Britons of the Isles. Wales had never been conquered by the Anglo-Saxons. It had never been conquered by Roman Catholicism. It was never conquered by the Normans. That is to say, the people never became English, never became Roman Catholic, and had no wish to become Anglo-Norman. An inherent defiance of external authority. They were anti-English, anti-Roman Catholic, anti-clerical, anti-papal, and anti-French. Over the years, the deeply hostile attitude towards the Roman Catholic Church in particular percolated, it permeated into the western counties of England. A case in point would be 3 of Thomas Becket's 4 assassins during the reign of the incoming Henry II. It's worthy of note that William de Tracy's family held Sudeley Castle at Winchcombe, a fact that the organiser of the royal tour would have been more than aware of. Once in the western region, the area of the Anarchy, Sudeley was the first place the great entourage visited. It's worthy of note that in the 1540s it became the home of Jane Seymour's brother, Thomas Seymour, and his new bride, the King's widow, Catherine Parr. They were both staunch Protestants. Catherine died and is buried there. The polarisation prevailed at the time of the Reformation, the time when England broke from Rome in the 1500s. The root of the 1535 royal progress was a strategic political move by the Cromwell-Seymour faction to oust the Francophile High Church apologist Anne de Boleyn and her faction from the governance of the king and the government of his kingdom. And it is overlaid here on this map. Anne de Boleyn later in An Old Tale of Wives. We shall see during the course of this series the break from Rome did not pass into law to facilitate Henry VIII's marriage to Anne de Boleyn. The reason that Parliament legislated was to end the conflict in England between the dual temporal and secular jurisdictions of government, and thus overturn the ancient but conflicting order of rule in the kingdom, and so exclude the Pope and his church usurping, as Parliament saw it, the powers properly belonging to the monarch. As a precursor to the work of the Reformation Parliament, the so-called Hun affair is often cited as an example of the depth of secular bitterness towards the ministers of the church. Richard Hun was a wealthy merchant in London. He became involved in a dispute with his priest over the funeral charges for his infant son. In an effort to remedy the situation, he referred the case to the common law courts. The church reacted to this secular move by arresting him on a charge of heresy, a serious charge to be heard in an ecclesiastical court, that is to say a church court. In December 1514 he was imprisoned by the church authorities and held in Lollard's Tower at St Paul's Cathedral to await his trial. But he was found dead, hanging from a rope in his cell. The church claimed it was suicide, but the coroner's jury could not be convinced, and the Bishop of London was accused of his murder. Thomas Wolsey, however, made sure that he did not face trial, a murder trial. The Richard Hun affair and the perception of rough justice, indeed very rough justice, by the church, particularly as the case began purely as a secular matter in the common courts, it caused outrage and fuelled a wave of anti-clericalism that can only really be said to have abated after the authority of Rome was severed by the Reformation Parliament in the 1530s. As we saw in episode 1, in January 1515, Francis became King of France. In September that year, Flashpoint Northern Italy ignited and blazed again when the young king, in a spectacular attack, crossed the Alps with an army of 30,000 and decisively defeated the hitherto invincible troops of the occupying Swiss Confederacy. France now threatened Rome and the Papal States. From that position of considerable strength, Francis redetermined the extent of papal authority in France, which was sealed by the Concord of Bologna the following year. This was a move that Henry VIII may have considered at some time, if it were not for the fact that a churchman already ruled his kingdom. Also in September 1515, in England, Thomas Wolsey received news that he had been elected to become a cardinal. Meanwhile, Charles had become concerned about his own inheritance of the Kingdom of Spain. He seemed to be worried that his Spanish-born younger brother, also named Ferdinand, had grown into greater favour with their grandfather, Ferdinand. So, still in 1515, in a crucial strategic move, Charles sent Adrian of Florence, also known as Adrian of Utrecht, who later became Pope Adrian VI, to Spain to secure an absolute assurance from Ferdinand that his Spanish lands would, beyond all doubt, be inherited by Charles and fall under his rule. Previously, Adrian had been an advisor to Margaret. He also became Charles's tutor and now served the Archduke as his advisor. Adrian was sufficiently persuasive of Ferdinand and succeeded on Charles's behalf in an act which he, in forthcoming years, gained high reward. It was a crucial strategic move because Ferdinand died in January 1516. Charles was now King of Spain, but he of course lived in the Netherlands, and so Adrian, in his absence, ruled Spain as his regent. The two dynastic enemies, Habsburg and Valois, on the 13th of August that year, signed the Treaty of Noyon. Francis recognised Charles's Spanish claim to Naples, and Charles recognised Francis' historical claim to Milan. This peace agreement allowed Charles to make that sea journey between the Netherlands and Spain, through the Strait of Dover and the English Channel, without interference from France. He set sail for his new kingdom, escorted by 40 ships, on the 8th of September 1517. Auntie Margaret again assumed the governorship of the Netherlands, and Charles arrived in Spain 10 days later. Now, 31st of October 1517 is a famous date in history. Yes, it is. It's the date when in Germany Martin Luther nailed his 35 theses against clerical abuses, including nepotism, simony, usury, pluralism and the sale of indulgences, to the door of Wittenberg Church in Saxony. The Christian faith was under attack from within. Again. Christian against Christian. So what does a good pope do when his followers turn on each other? Well, this one called for a crusade against the Turk, the Muslims. Appealing to the new young princes, Leo's plan was to unite the warring Christian kingdoms and for a truce to be declared throughout Christendom. He would be the arbiter of any disputes between his Christian flocks. Against the Turk, Emperor Maximilian and the King of France were to lead the army. England, Spain and Portugal would furnish the fleet, and the combined forces were to be directed against the enemy of the Church at Constantinople. So, on the 6th of March 1518, in Rome, Leo declared a 5-year truce, the length and breadth of Christendom. To promote the declaration, he dispatched 4 legates to the corners of Christendom. On the 15th of April, one of them, Cardinal Lorenzo Campeggio, set out for England as a legate a latere. As a representative of the Pope, the suffix a latere designated that Campeggio had been granted all the authority possessed by the Pope to represent the papacy. Therefore, any decision that Campeggio made was binding on the Pope. He had all the power of the Pope in Rome. As a legate a latere, however, he was of a higher rank than Wolsey. Through the king, Wolsey had been appealing to the Pope for some time to promote him to a latere status, but in fear of upsetting the French, Leo had avoided doing so. As de facto ruler of England, Wolsey now seized his chance to become the Pope's alter ego. He had previously harried Henry to undertake to him that no higher-ranking foreign officer of the papacy would be admitted to England. So, as it was, a request was dispatched to Rome to have Wolsey promoted. Unfortunately for Campeggio, he would have to wait at Calais for Wolsey's promotion to come through. Thus, Campeggio waited and waited at Calais until eventually Wolsey did receive his promotion from Rome. At last, Campeggio crossed the English Channel. He met Wolsey and revealed Leo's papal plan. Wolsey didn't like it, not one bit. After all, it was not Wolsey's idea, and anyway, he had devised a better strategy for Christendom to follow. While Campeggio waited at Calais, Wolsey had been conducting clandestine negotiations in London with Etienne de Ponthieu, Bishop of Paris, in a process initiated from Paris back in April 15. As a result of their deliberations, on the 2nd of October 1518, England and France bilaterally agreed Wolsey's new plan for perpetual peace in Christendom. Following that agreement, more than 20 other powers followed suit by signing up to the same contract. Indeed, by the following March, both Spain and Venice had also ratified the settlement, which was known as the Treaty of London. Wolsey had usurped the papal initiative and become the self-appointed arbiter and steward of Christendom. Arbiter of Christendom, a title, unofficial as it was, that the Cardinal later wallowed in. Was he must have wondered, the Pope in all but name. 1519 and the old guard was still changing. There was but one of the old sort left, but he, Maximilian, died on the 12th of January. Now, for whatever Charles inherited from his paternal grandfather, it did not include the sovereignty of the Holy Roman Emperor, because that was an elective monarchy, although it was highly unlikely that anyone other than a Habsburg would be elected. The leading contenders? Yes, Charles and Francis, and late in the day, Henry VIII threw his hat in. Much to Francis's frustration, Charles indeed was the victor. At the time Charles was being elected, so some memorable events were taking place in the life of Henry VIII.
Your beer, drink, 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 2 eyes that are bright as stars when they're shining on me. And drink, 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 2 lips that are red and sweet as the fruit on the tree. Here's a hope that those bright eyes will shine.
The first was that he had been called before his councillors and reprimanded for keeping company with his minions, the Hurrah Henrys, that is to say the hangers-on, which may be described as rich young men given much to public exhibitionism, drunkenness and similar antisocial activities, all based on an excess of snobbish self-esteem.
Salute you, sweetheart. Drink, 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 2 arms that are wide and warm as the rolling sun. Drink, 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 2 hearts that will love one only when I am the one. Here's a hope that those soft hands will...
According to the Venetian ambassador, it was all of great importance and soon the talk of the royal courts of all Christendom. The royal councillors declared that young men in his privy chamber, not regarding his estate nor degree, who were so familiar with him and so homely with him and played such light touches with him that they forget themselves, which things although the king of his gentle nature suffered, and not rebuked nor reproved. The king's council thought it not meet to be suffered for the king's honour. The upshot was that at least 8 of them were dismissed from court. There is a version of history that says the expulsions were made to rid from the court a group of people that Wolsey saw as a political threat to himself. But these were not men likely to threaten Wolsey's authority. The other version of history is, well, that the group was a drunken rabble, the running of the Privy Chamber was a shambles, and that the king was easily led into stupidity. The Privy Chamber was in need of a clear-out, and its members replacing with more serious men. And that's what happened. But whichever way you look at it, the nature of this king prevented him from organising his own household. Little wonder he needed Wolsey to run his kingdom. Henry's counsellors had taken him for a nitwit. Henry's second landmark event of 1519 was the birth of his son, Henry Fitzroy, on the 15th of June. The Fitzroy suffix designated that he was an acknowledged royal son, but born out of wedlock. The mother was Elizabeth Blount, Bessie to her friends, a renowned beauty of the court, who from that date on spent the most of the rest of her life married to Lincolnshire aristocrats. But more on Fitzroy later in the series. Back to an altogether higher level of sovereignty. A newly elected emperor, so protocol demanded, should be crowned by the Pope. But protocol and tradition also demanded that before that he must be crowned King of the Germans in Germany at the Palatine Chapel of the Imperial Free City of Aachen. The newly elected Emperor Charles, of course, was in Spain. Safe passage between Spain and the Empire, as when he arrived in 1517, required peace between the major powers. For that peace, Charles would rely on Wolsey's Treaty of London and its guarantees, which had held since 1518. The treaty obliged the contracting parties not to attack one another, and accordingly commit to come to the aid of any that suffered attack. Wolsey invited Charles to visit England on his journey by ship to the Low Countries. It was an ostentatious invitation and was heralded as an honour to England to be the first country to host the new emperor. Wolsey's original proposal was for Charles to land at Southampton in the spring of 1520. The Cardinal had been a busy man, because he had also organised a spectacular meeting between Henry VIII and France at a venue just outside Calais. The meeting is famously known as the Field of Cloth of Gold. The date? The 7th to the 20th of June. Wolsey had engineered himself into a position to organise the three young monarchs, and now prepared to posture as their papa. Charles reappointed Adrian as the regent in Spain and set sail for England. He arrived on the 26th of May, 1520, and was met just offshore by Wolsey, not at Southampton as originally planned, but now at Dover. Charles witnessed a vast and busy fleet in the Channel and Strait of Dover, sailing back and forth to and from Calais, ferrying thousands of dignitaries, their servants, and any amount of equipment in preparation for the Field of Cloth of Gold. This was a demonstration of an English naval prowess, and staged to impress Charles as much as it was to impress Francis. Henry met with Charles at Dover Castle that night. The Emperor stayed for 3 days with Henry and Catherine at Canterbury, where the English court was lodged, together with a multitude of dignitaries who were gathering for the crossing to Calais a few days later. Charles then sailed to Flushing, and on almost the same tide, Henry, Wolsey and Catherine crossed to Calais on the 31st of May to meet Francis. The claim to fame of the Field of the Cloth of Gold, aside from its extravagance, was the wrestling match in which Francis beat Henry. After it all finished on the 20th of June, Wolsey and Henry reunited for another meeting with Charles on the border of his empire at Gravelines. What was discussed at Gravelines? After Gravelines, they all packed up and went home. They went their separate ways for now, but Wolsey knew that sooner rather than later, Charles would need to return to Spain and relieve Adrian of the regency. He knew that soon the problem of Charles's separated domains, kingdom and empire, would arise again. The Cardinal knew that with the English navy at his disposal, he controlled the Strait of Dover in the English Channel. After all, he'd just demonstrated that to both Charles and Francis. Wolsey began to prepare for one of the biggest double crosses in history. This man's selfish ambitions had no bounds, and the consequences of his actions still resonate today. So thank you very much for watching, and next time we're heading off to Bruges. So I hope to see you there, or if you prefer, meet in London before we set off. See you next time.